psychedelics seek to this, to attain this kind of state. That's so interesting.
Well, you mentioned psychedelics, DMT and 5-MeO DMT, these create this religious experience, this connection. People describe them as a strong connection to God. People who are, as agnostic or atheistic as you'd like, they can feel connected to God in these states. I had a patient. Here was a guy who had never had a psychiatric illness or symptom in his life. He was a retirement age gentleman, and he had never been religious particularly before either. Certainly no passionate, type of religion. But he had a stressful experience, actually a post 9/11 change in how he was thinking, and he was pushed into a manic state, revealing that he had bipolar, never before known in this case, in this person. And his mania, his elevated state in bipolar, included this profound religiosity which he had never had before. And he was preaching in a elevated, vigorous way to his family. And so this state can be created in people even late in life who had no predisposition for it.
Last fall, interestingly enough, the first archaeochemical data for the ritual consumption of psychedelics associated with cave art was finally published. It's not that ancient. It's only about 400 or 500 years ago, but it came from the Pinwheel Cave, a Chumash site in California. And what they found were datura quids, like these chewed up, you mentioned how did they ingest it? These chewed up quids, like these bunches of datura, which contain these very powerful tropane alkaloids, and what was believed to be some kind of Chumash initiation site. So we can say that there is initial, archaeochemical data for the consumption of psychedelics in cave art. And so where else might we find this? Look at the literature from the 1st century AD, Dioscorides, for example. He writes this massive treatise at the exact same time the Gospels are being written. And Dioscorides, in just one of his books, talks about 56 detailed recipes for spiking wine. He talks about black nightshade producing fantasias ou aedais, not unpleasant visions. What today we would say is psychedelics. Even at the Theater of Dionysus, separate from his outdoor churches, there was a wine served there called drima. And this is the wine that gives birth to Hollywood. I mean, the ancient Hollywood was there at the Theater of Dionysus. This is where comedy and tragedy and poetry and music come from. But rather than a hot dog and a beer, what they drink at the Theater of Dionysus was this wine called drima, which means pounded or rubbed. And Professor Ruck talks about maybe it was the drugs that were rubbed into this theatrical beverage to help the play come alive. What you see there is the creation of these states of awareness in which, again, you identify with the God to become the God.
I suspect that a way to look at psychedelics is that they induce particular types of lucid dreaming states. So it's a state in which certain connections are being severed in your mind, they're no longer active, where your mind basically gets free to move in a certain direction because some particular inhibition doesn't work anymore. So psychedelics can, for instance, teleport people into a universe that is hyperbolic, which means that if you imagine a room that you're in, you can turn around 360 degrees and you didn't go full circle. You need to go 720 degrees to go full circle.
Exactly.
So the things that people learn in that state cannot be easily transferred in this universe that we are in. A lot of the people that tell me that they use psychedelics in a useful way, they basically saw and experienced a space of possibilities. They experienced what it would be like to be another person. And they took important lessons from that experience back home. I know several people who swear to me that LSD has cured their migraines. So severe cluster 8 headaches or migraines that didn't respond to standard medication that disappeared after a single dose. And I don't recommend anybody doing this, especially not in the US where it's illegal. And there are no studies on this for that reason. But it seems that anecdotally that it basically can reset the serotonergic system. So it's basically pushing them outside of their normal boundaries. And as a result, it needs to find a new equilibrium. And in some people, that equilibrium is better.
Sasha Shulgin, who sort of the godfather of MDMA, and he had a tremendous experience. But what he said about it was he was having a human experience that the mescaline was helping him access, rather than that he was having a mescaline experience. That I think these psychedelics reveal things that are within us. Some things that are how we process information back when we were children. Other things that we've never thought of before that are sort of baked into our consciousness. I think culture is more determinative of what people experience under psychedelics, your preconceptions, than we give it credit for. And so I think there's a lot of priming, that you could say, that people receive by stories from their culture. With ayahuasca, it's about jaguars and Amazonian animals, and so much of psychedelic experiences are poetic and metaphorical. I mean, you could take, veterans who've never read a book of poetry in their lives, and under the influence of MDMA, just what they describe, the imagery and the way they describe their experience is metaphorical, poetic. It's incredible. That gets us to this idea of psychedelics for vision quest, particularly for younger people. When you're sort of moving into this adulting kind of phase and you have to figure out what are you going to do with your life, there's so many options. A lot of people, of course, feel constrained that they have very few options, but I think this idea of psychedelics as a way to help you find your calling or find your vision or find your unique leverage point, I think we'll see that more and more as our culture evolves and gets healthier around the use of psychedelics.
So not traveling through physical space, it's the other dimensions that we're talking about. You're traveling through some other dimension to meet some other creature. People talk with DMT that they meet some elves and or like creatures, like entities. Like who are they? What is this?
Is it because they're high, or it's because
they're actually meeting something?
Yeah.
This is the Joe Rogan philosophy.
But I do know that past civilization a lot of them were based on shamanism. And you know what I think it's sad is if someone drink alcohol and when he's drunk he's going to commit like murders or something, we're gonna blame the person, right? We're gonna say that's his fault. It's not the fault of alcohol. However, if someone does psychedelic or any things that is illegal and you do something crazy, now we're gonna put the fault on psychedelic. You know what I mean? And perhaps the person itself is the reason why he's been doing these things. You know what I mean? So yeah, it's fascinating how society.
When we say psychedelic, that refers to, for most people, a broad number of compounds that work in different pharmacological ways. Psychedelics, though, someone takes the right dose, they're strapped into the roller coaster. And something interesting is going to happen. MDMA, it's very common for people to have this, they still are perceiving themselves as a self, but it's common for them to have this warmth, this empathy for humanity and for their friends and loved ones. So many people come out of these sessions saying that they didn't know it was possible to have an experience like that. So for example, if someone says that they felt like they touched another dimension, or they felt like they sensed the reality of God, or if they just you name it, people's ontological views can sometimes shift. I think that's more about where they're coming from, and I don't think it's the quintessential way in which they work. There's plenty of people that hold on to a completely naturalistic viewpoint and have profound and helpful experiences with these compounds. But the subjective effects can be so broad that for some people it shifts their philosophical viewpoint more towards idealism, more towards thinking of that the nature of reality might be more about consciousness than about material. The experiences on these compounds can be so far out there or so deep. And they're doing that by tinkering with the same machinery that's going on up there. You could take a relatively small number of these molecules, throw them into the nervous system, and then have a 60-year-old person who has, you name it, I mean, that has hiked to the top of Everest and that speaks 5 languages and that has been married and has kids and grandkids and has, you name it, like been at the top, and say, this fundamentally changed who I am as a person and what I think life is about. Like that's the thing about psychedelics that just floors me, and it never fails.
I think what they're doing at Hopkins is amazing. He has a collaborator there, actually, that had a very popular paper I just throw out there for fun, who was a postdoc at Stanford. Her name is Gül. She's Turkish, I believe. She had a paper showing that she put octopi on MDMA, on ecstasy, and found out, this was published in Current Biology, showing, it was a great journal, showing that the octopi then wanted to spend more time with other octopi. They started cuddling.
Yeah.
So they're colleagues out there. But the Hopkins, it's clear that there's a very close relationship between hallucinogenic states and dreaming of the sort that would describe for REM dreaming. And there's a terrific set of books and body of scientific literature from a guy named Alan Hobson, who was an MD, is at Harvard Med, and he wrote books like Dream Drugstore, and he really understood the relationship between LSD and REM dreams and how similar they are. Psychedelics have some very interesting properties. They are certainly not for everybody, right? And kids, it's a problem. It's clear that they can unveil certain elements of neuroplasticity. They make the brain amenable to change, changing up space-time relationships, changing up the emotional load of an event and being able to reframe that. It's clear that happens.
So Joe Rogan apparently and many others meet apparently elves when they on DMT. A lot of people report this kind of creatures that they see.
Mm-hmm.
And
It's not just your perception being broadened or changed. It's you, according to Terence McKenna, feeling fairly unchanged, but catapulted into a different circumstance. You have been shot elsewhere and find yourself in relationship to other entities of some kind. Right? So the place is populated with things that seem not to be your mind.
so it does feel like travel to another place because you're unchanged yourself.
Just think of how insane that experience is. I mean, you've forgotten where you were, right? That's the strangest part. I mean, this is psychosis, right? In every room in the mansion of dreams, all light switches are dimmer switches. Like if you go into a dark room and flip on the light, it gradually comes up. It doesn't come up instantly. In a dream, if you look at text, a page of text, or a sign, or a television that has text on it, and then you turn away and you look back at that text, the text will have changed, right? There's the total, it's just a chronic instability.